Nobody would, I think, deny that science is subject to certain social factors. Social norms affect what gets studied and how it gets studied. So the parts of biology that plausibly bear on human health are much more likely to get funding than other parts of biology, all other things equal. And changing views within our society about the moral status of non-human animals have had a clear impact on whether and how certain studies get conducted. Those are social influences on science, and they are, I think, rather uncontroversial. What engenders controversy is not the idea that society affects the goals and methods of science. It's the idea that social factors affect the content of judgments within science that bothers people. It's fine if we gather more evidence about some questions than about others, but on traditional views, once a question is posed, only evidence should affect the answer, and social factors shouldn't affect what counts as evidence. Now, Kuhn blurred this line. He emphasized the extent to which science can profitably be understood as a social practice, one that unfolds in social and historical space, in addition to or instead of, depending on how you read Kuhn, logical space. The notion of a reason for Kuhn is crucially tied to the way one is educated into a scientific paradigm, and the notion of a crisis gets spelled out not primarily in terms of the evidence in favor of a paradigm falling below a certain threshold, but in terms of the way confidence is sustained and undermined across a particular group of people. Kuhn further suggests that it's a good thing for science that non-epistemic social considerations, like the age or nationality of scientists, sometimes plays a role in scientific decision-making. So the notion of a reason or of what's good for science is a somewhat, at least, social notion for Kuhn. As we saw, it's not exactly clear what role Kuhn allowed for distinctively epistemic norms that are so dear to philosophers, or at least philosophers other than Paul Feyerabend. Kuhn claims that science is governed by intellectual values like simplicity and suggestiveness, but not that these values are truth-linked. It makes puzzle-solving progress despite the profound incommensurability that he thinks characterizes science, but he doesn't think that science progresses towards the truth. In this Kuhnian aftermath, as everybody's trying to figure out how to approach science, a new approach emerged in the discipline of sociology that makes much more of the social factors and much less of the epistemic ones than Kuhn had. The most influential version of this called itself the Strong Program in the Sociology of Science, and it originated at the University of Edinburgh in the 70s. This new discipline, or subdiscipline, set itself up as a science of science, and the Strong Program made some strong claims indeed. Among other things, it set itself up as a successor discipline, that's their term, to the philosophy of science. It regarded the philosophy of science as more or less wholly misguided, for reasons we will display shortly. So, truth in advertising, you should know that philosophers and sociologists of science don't generally get along too well. Sociologists would give a rather different report on this subject matter than I'm going to. We saw once upon a time that thinkers like Popper and the positivists thought that the logic or method underlying science helped to explain the success of science. Traditional intellectual historians and sociologists might not have done it their way. They might not have appealed to a logic or method, as the positivists would, but they would have appealed to values or norms in a broadly Kuhnian spirit that are recognizably internal to science. So Robert Merton, for instance, the most prominent traditional sociologist of science, examines scientific communities and describes the norms that he thinks govern such communities. What makes it a scientific community includes such norms as respect for evidence. Now, these traditional approaches, both within philosophy and in disciplines like history or sociology, all have the consequence that paradigmatically bad episodes of science should get explained differently than paradigmatically good ones. So Einstein's discovery of special relativity is supposed to be explained in part by the scientific method that he used of clarifying concepts and subjecting them to experiential tests. But those scientists who rejected relativity during World War I because Einstein was German, or during World War II because Einstein was Jewish, violated the logic or method or values of science. And so we explain those failings of scientific rationality quite differently than we explain the successes of scientific rationality. The proponents of the Strong Program repudiate what they see as an ungrounded explanatory asymmetry here. They object to the idea that some beliefs are to be explained by saying that they fit the way the world is, or that they're well supported by the evidence, while other beliefs are explained as due to bias or irrationality or weakness. That might seem commonsensical to many people, and it does to many philosophers. To advocates of the strong program, it seems unfair. The centerpiece of their program is what they call the symmetry principle. And it requires that beliefs which, by our lights, are judged to be unreasonable or untrue, should get explained in the very same way as beliefs that, by our lights, are reasonable or true. And their argument for this is, just as scientists use the same principles to explain why bridges stay up and why bridges fall down, a science of science should use the same principles to explain beliefs that we think are solid and well-grounded, and beliefs that we think are shaky and ill-grounded. So the idea is to look at a scientific community as an anthropologist does, and assimilate it to other kinds of communities. So the scientific community is governed by implicit social norms, just like all communities are. These norms indicate who gets ignored, who gets listened to. The norms govern how money and prestige are distributed. The norms govern conflict resolution, how you have to make your case if you want to get listened to. So in some communities, if there's a disagreement, it's settled by a duel or by an appeal to the Council of Elders. The scientific community has elaborate rituals for settling these things. They involve journals and letters to the editor, but they're to be seen as rituals. And like many communities, the scientific community has built into it that its beliefs are better than the beliefs of other communities. But the strong programmers are not particularly inclined to take that belief of science seriously any more than an anthropologist studying a tribe that believes in certain kinds of magic is committed to that tribe's view that its beliefs are better than competing beliefs. So the idea behind the strong program is that truth, evidence, and reality should not get any special, in their sense, place in the explanation of scientific beliefs. All beliefs should be explained by local norms and by non-epistemic interests, often associated with the place one occupies in a social network. So the fact that a believer is male or female, rich or poor, German or French, can play a crucial role in explaining the belief. But the fact that the believer is smart or rational is not supposed to play a role in explaining the belief. So, in the view of the strong programmers, philosophers of science try to explain beliefs in terms of otherworldly conceptions of knowledge and truth, while they want to appeal to more causal, more natural, they think, conceptions like what a community lets count as knowledge, what a community counts as the truth. So those sorts of reconstructions of the notions of knowledge and truth, plus social non-epistemic interests, are the only factors you can appeal to explain why people believe what they do, why they change their beliefs as they do. Sometimes the kinds of explanation on offer are not entirely clear. In some of the starker cases, it's clearly causal, a little brazenly causal, one might think. So it was suggested in a book that was influential in the 1970s that quantum mechanics, which in its classical interpretation says that some events are utterly uncaused, we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the course, was adopted by German scientists after World War I, not because it's true or well-grounded, but in order to regain the prestige they had had before the war. It was a sort of depressing time after losing World War I in Germany, and Germans were sort of cynical about progress and causation and ideas like that. And so the claim is that the desire for social status, not evidence, caused scientists to adopt quantum mechanics, or at least to interpret the data of quantum mechanics as they did. It was trendy to give up on causation, oversimplifying a good bit. Now, that kind of argument has often seemed simplistic, even to people who are sympathetic to this overall approach. It's rare, though it might sometimes happen, that social and political interests straightforwardly determine scientific opinions. So one can stay within this school and back away from such brazenly causal claims, but attempts to make the approach less simplistic tend to make it less clear. A sociologist could make a convincing argument that certain scientific ideas might benefit a certain group of people, but that doesn't yet show you that the benefit explains why the views were adopted. It might have gone well for German scientists to be associated with non-causal theories. That doesn't mean they adopted the theories for that reason. None of this is to not deny that some of the arguments the radical new sociologists of science have offered can be good ones. Some of them are pretty well supported and quite interesting. With the right sort of evidence, one maybe could make a good argument that Darwinism caught on as well as it did, as quickly as it did, in part because lots of successful, powerful people liked to think of themselves as biologically fit. There's an argument to be made there. But the strong program is a program, not a particular claim, and it's the programmatic statement that it's never appropriate to explain beliefs in terms of truth, rationality, or evidence that most distinguishes contemporary sociologists of science from contemporary philosophers of science. Philosophers tend to find that general programmatic argument systematically flawed. So some sociologists appeal to underdetermination results from Quine. They think that the evidence is more or less powerless to help us choose among theories. Too many theories are incompatible with each other, but compatible with the evidence. And yet the sociologists seem to think that interest can sort through underdetermination rather easily, though evidence cannot. Philosophers want to know how it is that it's so easy to tell which theory best fits a group's interest, but so hard to tell which theory best fits the evidence. If we can generate lots and lots of incompatible theories, why aren't they as hard to reconcile with political or other interests as they are with supposed evidence? Even Kuhn, who was something of a hero to the strong programmers, pretty strongly rejected their attempt to assimilate him to their cause. Kuhn does, as we've seen, leave some room for class interests, political interests, etc., to play a role, especially in crisis science. But even in crisis science, that's a relatively minor role. Those interests serve mainly as randomizing factors, distributing how much attention gets paid to various new proto-paradigms. They're factors that prevent premature consensus. Kuhn does talk about power relations within science. So, for instance, the dominant paradigm gets to write the textbooks. But Kuhn does clearly think that science is epistemically distinctive, and part of the way that science maintains its epistemic distinctiveness is that it's pretty insulated from direct social and political influences on its content. The strong programmers don't think science is nearly that insulated from such interests. Now, the reaction of the strong programmers against traditional views like positivism actually shows them to be carrying a surprising amount of positivist baggage. We're often most influenced by those against whom we react most violently. Like the positivists, the sociologists of science tend to have a fairly narrow conception of what counts as reasoning or evidence. It's got to be alogic, it's got to be formal or rule-governed. And the more narrowly you construe evidence and reason, the easier it is to say they're not doing any work here. So in that sense, the positivists play into the sociologists' hands because they have a hard time counting as a reason anything that doesn't, for instance, solve the problem of induction in more or less formal terms. We saw similar considerations at play with respect to Kuhn on observation. He reacts perhaps too violently against his positivist predecessors and seems caught up in an idea that arguably they share, that observation, in order to be observation, would have to be pure and independent of theory. But we've seen that maybe something can count as an observation while being, to some extent, infected with theory. But on the issue of reasoning, Kuhn is arguably more sophisticated either than the positivists on the one hand or the strong programmers on the other, because he does not insist on contrasting the realms of the social and the rational to the extent that they do. Kuhn allows that certain social arrangements tend to produce reasonable outcomes. The positivists and the sociologists tend to agree in their insistence that the context of discovery, how one arrives at a theory, and the context of justification, how it becomes supported by the evidence, have nothing to do with each other. And the sociologists reject justification in favor of discovery, the positivists reject discovery in favor of justification. Kuhn rejects the separation. We also saw that within science, Kuhn does accept a kind of relativism. Standards of evidence and justification can only be made relative to a paradigm. But on the other hand, Kuhn does not seem to be a relativist about science. He thinks science has made objective progress in accumulating puzzle-solving power, and that certain values are common to all science, and even that science is objectively a better way of investigating the natural world than any of its competitors. But it's not clear how stable this combination of views is. Can Kuhn combine his relativistic tendencies with his objectivist tendencies? The strong programmers make a clear choice, and they go down a more relativist path than Kuhn does. Any belief about the superiority of science to any other practice is to be explained from within the local norms of the scientific community, and no such judgments have any standing outside those norms. So science, like many communities, says we're the ones who've gotten the world right, but that has no status on any other communities. Relativistic views like this always face a problem of self-reference. I have friends who are anthropologists who are willing really to bite the bullet here and say, pretty much, it's objectively true that nothing is objectively true. But that's a statement that tends to work against itself. Right? What they're saying is, it is cross-culturally true that nothing is cross-culturally true except this truth. That's a difficult position to maintain. It's not clear whether it's completely logically self-undermining. It gets pretty fancy there, but it's awkward. How do strong programmers handle this problem? Well, since they think of themselves as doing a science of science, most sociologists accept that the strictures of the strong program apply to itself. So their own views are not the truth about science, namely that it's governed by the interests of scientists. It's the interests of strong programmers that induce them to claim that science is governed by the interests of scientists. This doesn't automatically undermine their conclusions, but it's something to keep in mind. They're not putting forward, they can't put forward their conclusions about science as the right view about science. Now, we've so far looked mainly at the epistemology of the strong program. The strong program also tends towards a metaphysical view that it shares with a number of other schools of thought in the sciences and the humanities. Like the epistemological views we just saw, this view follows a similar path out of Kuhn towards someplace more radical than Kuhn was willing to go. One of the classic works in this field is by Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaeffer, and it's called Leviathan and the Air Pump. It studies the rise of experimentation, they call it the experimental life, in the England of the late 17th century. Plausibly, they locate a social function for experimentation. It was designed to settle disputes in a public and cooperative way so that tempers wouldn't get too involved. And they suggested that the motivation for this was at least as much political as epistemic. In this time, there had been religious wars across Europe, and it was important to try to find a method of settling questions amicably. And a public, evidential approach to these things looked promising. Shapin and Schaeffer suggest that Robert Boyle's vacuum pump was designed to replace debatable, unsolvable metaphysical questions like, can there be a void? Can a pure vacuum exist? Which was tied up with various theological and philosophical issues. That needed to be transformed into a publicly, experimentally settleable question. And the idea is, what we've come to know as science emerges largely for political reasons because people didn't want to have to settle these big philosophical questions. They needed a different question to answer. So political issues, they suggest, largely determined what could count as knowledge. And we've seen some problems with this kind of analysis above. This is a particularly subtle, interesting version of the approach. It's not clear whether this approach will work in all scientific cases. But here we're looking at the metaphysical implications of the story they tell. They want to claim that Boyle was engaged in the business of manufacturing facts. That sounds like somebody who's falsifying the data, but that's not what they mean. A philosopher would normally understand a phrase like Boyle was manufacturing facts as something like Boyle was helping determine which things would be believed to be factual, which things would get counted as a fact as opposed to an opinion. He was altering the conception of a fact that had credence in 17th century England. The sociologists, at least by our lights, generally refuse to distinguish that gloss on what Boyle was doing from what philosophers consider a very different claim, namely that Boyle was making up a part of the world. The sociologists will not distinguish that claim from the one we were just talking about. So they seem to insist on the conception that we found a little bewildering in Kuhn, namely that a paradigm or practice determines the world. It doesn't just determine beliefs about the world, it determines the world. Views like these, according to which reality is made rather than found, are usually called social constructivist. There are a whole lot of views like this. It's hard to lump them together, but we're going to need to do that a little bit in order to get through this stuff. Most such views are tricky to make out. Even at his most radical, Kuhn couldn't have thought that paradigms completely determine reality, though he sometimes writes that way. But if they did, there would be no anomalies, right? The world would be as the paradigm says it is. So despite some suggestions that different scientists inhabit completely different worlds because their paradigm makes up their world, that can't quite be Kuhn's view. The picture, rather, seems to be that insofar as we have any notion of reality, our access to it is so mediated by language, by political and other interests, that we can't do anything that's worth calling responding to reality, getting it right, taking it into account. And so we're better off not talking that way. I think this is a reasonably charitable version of what these guys are trying to claim, though it's hard to sort it through. So Chapin and Schaeffer claim that it is ourselves and not reality that is responsible for what we know. As we've seen before, there's something that might be right here, but it gets lost in a kind of melodramatic expression, or at least so most philosophers of science would think. Ask a sociologist if you want a more favorable gloss on this. The assumption seems to be that only unmediated access to reality counts as access to reality at all. Our interests, our language, everything about us filters or blinds us, prevents us from seeing things as they are. And so if we're to encounter reality, it would have to be what Thomas Nagel calls the view from nowhere. We would have to see it from no place in particular. But it's a false dichotomy that either we're responsible for what we believe or the world is. We saw a similar problem with Kuhn, and quite late in the course, we'll try to set up an alternative conception of this that makes reality more accessible to us, relies less on this idea of unproblematic presentation with reality. Before we do that, we can at least get a start on cleaning up some of this confusing terminology. There's nothing in this domain of philosophy that's uncontroversial, so I'm just going to give you my view on this, though it's reasonably mainstream among philosophers. If everything is socially constructed, it's not very interesting to be told of anything in particular that it's socially constructed. It's like saying, here's my bold conjecture, something's going to happen today. It's true, but it's not useful. If the notion is to be useful, we're going to have to draw some distinctions. So let's note, first of all, that being socially constructed doesn't mean that it's less than fully real. Buicks are socially constructed. They are the outcome of a complex social practice, but a Buick is pretty real. Right? Let one run over you and you will, as it were, feel its reality. What does real mean here? Roughly, something is real if it has the properties it has, independently of what you and I and everyone else thinks about it. So the notion of a fiction is something that has whatever properties I decide it has. The notion of reality is something that has its properties independently of my decision or belief about them. It's a pretty basic point, but it allows us to at least begin doing justice to the bewildering variety of kinds of interactions between our beliefs and interests on the one hand, and anything worth calling reality on the other. So, are nations like Japan real or social constructions? It's a bad question. They're real in some straightforward senses, and they're constructions, and maybe real, maybe unreal in other senses. Their existence doesn't depend on what you or I, or even the United Nations, thinks about them, but it's also recognizably dependent on some kind of social arrangement in a way that a Buick is not. Some kind of properly issued decree could dissolve a nation or a corporation, but no mere uttering of words is going to dissolve a Buick. There are different kinds of reality here. So the most interesting use for a term like social construction is to refer to things that would have no existence were it not for certain practices, but which we might think have more independence from such practices than they do. So there's a legitimate use for social construction talk about a notion like race, if what you're suggesting is that it's biologically unreal but socially real. You're drawing a useful distinction between the kind of reality that you think it has and the kind of reality that you think it might be mistaken as having. We turn now to an approach to science studies that often gets lumped in with Feyerabend and the Strong program and with other views of what we might call the radical post-Kuhnian wing of approaches to science. but the actual arguments overlap only somewhat slightly. Postmodernism comes out of the humanities, mostly literature departments, where the strong program comes out of social science departments. Very loosely speaking, postmodernism rests on some views about language and reality. It questions the ability of language and other sign systems to represent anything worth calling as real. The idea is a sign can only represent another sign and can never get out of this whole system of signs to talk about anything more real or more enduring than signs. It's a bunch of interesting philosophical stuff to roll up our sleeves and get into here, but little of it bears directly enough on the philosophy of science. If you're a postmodernist, science's apparent success at getting the world right is going to have to be debunked or deflated, because postmodernism says that the notion of getting the world right is a deeply flawed notion. So for postmodernists, science is going to have to amount to a kind of literary genre, rather a badly written literary genre, when you think of it that way, because nature is going to have to be a sort of text. There's nothing but signs. And so scientists are just interpreting a certain kind of literary text. So these folks have drawn attention to the rhetorical strategies and the use of things like metaphors in science. That's often pretty interesting. But most folks have been unpersuaded by the end of the day that science is just a tedious literary genre. Why would we put so much money and time and attention into science if we thought it was just really sleep-inducing literary criticism? Scientists, understandably, have been pretty unimpressed by this approach because it's a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't matter about the nuances of a particular scientific argument or evidence. It says there's no such thing as evidence in the scientific sense. On the other hand, postmodernists have often thought scientists were epistemologically and politically naive and conservative. They're stuck in this idea that they can just see the world as it is. The stage was thus set for some brief, well-publicized, and rather demoralizing debates called the Science Wars, mostly in the mid-1990s. These debates produced heat without light. Lots of books that sold lots of copies, lots of sort of yelling across this divide, but not much illumination. The publicity high point, anyway, of the Science Wars occurred when the physicist Alan Sokal submitted a parody of postmodernist physics to a journal called Social Text. The article he submitted was called "Transgressing the Boundaries Toward a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity," and it is every bit as silly as it sounds. He was making fun in very broad strokes of this approach. The editors of the journal, however, didn't realize that. They accepted the paper and published it seriously, whereupon Sokal revealed his hoax. Unlike many critics of postmodernism, Sokal was not a kind of cultural conservative. He thought the political left was falling prey to postmodernist confusion, and he wanted to try to show the left the way out of the postmodernist wilderness. Quite apart from the left-right cultural politics of the Science Wars, I am forced to opine again, it's hard to talk about this stuff without laying some of one's cards on the table, that we're better off without the Science Wars. On the one hand, as with some of the other radical epistemological positions that we have studied, postmodernism is an overreaction to a genuine problem. We have learned in the 20th century that knowledge and representation are not as simple as we once might have thought. But the fact that they're not as simple as we once might have thought doesn't mean they're obviously impossible. That's to throw out a lot of baby with the bathwater. And like some of the sociologists of science, postmodernists have a tendency to treat political interests as real and causally powerful in a way that physical objects are not. And that seems a little peculiar. Why deny causal power to physical objects but give it to political interests? And postmodernism faces that serious self-reference problem discussed before. But though the people on the other side thought of themselves as the defenders of reason and truth, their arguments were not, in general, a whole lot better. Many such folks thought that the demarcation problem was easily and obviously solvable. It was clear what science was. It was clear they took the evidence into account. It's unproblematic what counts as evidence. They jettisoned just about as much philosophy of science as the postmodernists did. And even worse, some of them wrote as if it's heretical. It's to be anti-reason, to raise questions about science's epistemic credentials, or to raise political questions about what scientific studies get done and why. So if it was inappropriate of postmodernists to be as dismissive as they had been of science, it was also inappropriate for some of their critics to treat science as above reproach or criticism. There are badly run studies and there are bad political arrangements within science to some extent, and they don't deserve deference just because they're science, or part of science. Clark Gleamore, a philosopher of science, said, "There are only two kinds of people in the world, logical positivists and goddamn English professors." If he's right, we're in trouble, because both positivism and social constructivism appear to be in trouble. The idea of an objective, context-free logic of science now looks naive. But postmodernism looks, at best, cynical. We haven't looked at all the variations and combinations of views on either side here, but at this point we're going to abandon this narrative, go back to the early days of the positivist project, and try to mine for additional resources to understand science more richly.